Hey guys, welcome back to Andy's Dinosaur Reviews, and today we are going to take a look at another Jurassic World Dominion figure, and it is another of the 5-inch basics. And not only another of the new ones, it is the only other new one that is currently out, which is the Therizinosaurus. So, very exciting to not only have another Jurassic World Dominion figure here today to take a look at, but also another one of the brand new species entering the film and entering the franchise, which is the Therizinosaurus. This figure was definitely a little bit of a hassle for me to find. I actually had put up a post in the community section asking people if they could potentially locate one for me because my local Aldi's did not have one, and quite a few people had stepped up to acquire one for me, so a huge thank you goes out to everybody that was attempting to score one for me. Last night I ended up driving an hour away in a desperate attempt to get a hold of one to my final Aldi's that I have nearby, and sure enough, there was one, and that was it. There was no Giganotosaurus, no Velociraptor Blue, nothing but one Therizinosaurus, and it was actually kind of buried under some stuff, so I was very lucky to finally find one, but very psyched at the same time now to have it here. So again, a huge thank you to everybody that did, try to help me to acquire one. Definitely very kind of you all, but really happy to have officially found one. And again, you can see the really cool Jurassic World Dominion logo here in the front, as well as the face of Rexy right there. And then I knocked it over. And then if we take a look here at the back, again, the same figures that we saw yesterday on the Giganotosaurus review. And you also have the Velociraptor Blue and, of course, our Therizinosaurus. So let's go ahead, pop this open, and take a look at it. And here is our adorable little 5-inch basic Therizinosaurus. I'm trying to get a good spot for him to stand. He actually has pretty good balance. But definitely a really cool figure. I'm really happy to already have a Therizinosaurus from the Mattel Jurassic World line here in my collection. Really excited to have the 5-inch basic version, although I'm one of very few people out there that actually collect this line. I think the only two that I know for sure would be me and Tim from Collect Jurassic that would be particularly interested in making sure we acquire all of the figures from this line. So really happy to have this particular version, especially because, again, they're so hard to find in my area. Like, when I had found out that Aldi had them, I rushed to the store because I knew if I didn't, I wasn't going to have a chance to get this figure later on. So really, again, excited that a store near me actually did have these in stock, because that pretty much never happens. But I think the sculpt and everything looks pretty fun. Again, as always, we have the obvious proportion issues, although I will say that this one doesn't look near as bad as some of the others when it comes to the size of the feet. It's a very cool, shrunken down, kind of smaller version of the Therizinosaurus. So let's go ahead and jump straight to a closer look at it right now. So starting up here at the head sculpt of our Therizinosaurus, you can see that it does sport some pretty nice detail, but it's not overly detailed. Like, I don't think it's quite as nice as what we saw in the Giganotosaurus, because some of the areas of the face almost kind of look a little muted, but I think it might just be because the figure's so small, because at the same time that it kind of looks a little muted, it does have some detailing there, and I think it's just not quite as visible as you saw in the Giganotosaurus, because the Giganotosaurus had more of like a really scaly look, whereas this one just has more of like a smoother skin texture with just some very, very fine detail. Like, if I turn it in the light and let the light hit it, you can start to see some of the detail, and it does, if my camera would focus on it, it does actually look pretty good. We do have the beak up here in the front of the snout of our Therizinosaurus. You can also see some feathers here kind of leading off of the lower jaw. You've got a eye painted with a yellow, but it looks as though the pupil, unfortunately, is the same greenish color that we have for the body right there. And the eye over here, although a little sloppy, isn't near as bad as the Giganotosaurus was yesterday. But again, the eye would have certainly looked better with a black pupil rather than that green color, but considering it's just a small 5-inch basic figure, it is what it is. It actually has more paint application than I was expecting. Yesterday, the Giganotosaurus really had just green and black, and that's it. This one at least looks to have 3 different tones of color, as we have a nice, very similar green to the Giganotosaurus, and then we transition to a very dark blue here in the back of the head, and you can see all of the really nice, very fine feathers picking up here, running down the course of the neck of our Therizinosaurus. And I will say the feather detail does actually look pretty nice for what this figure is, being just a nice, small, 5-inch basic figure. It's got some pretty nice feather detail, even though it's very fine in the back of the neck. You can see the throat here, as well as quite a bit of like skin wrinkling and stuff running down the throat, which definitely looks pretty nice. As we move back up here, you start to see some dark reds pick up here in the back of the neck, and those dark reds run down the course of the body until we get around the hip region there, and then they of course disappear. You can see the feather detail, I think, a little nicer in the reddish areas because the color's a little bit brighter than the dark blue, which really helps to highlight the feather detail. You can also see the spinal column there running along the back of the dinosaur. Here we've got a little area of the shoulder blade kind of protruding. As we move down the arm, you can see we have a mixture of skin and feathers. It's just some like stragglers here hanging off of the back of the arm as far as the feathers go, but we can see some pretty nice muscle definition and some decent skin texture in the actual arms, and then we lead down into the hands. You have some nice scoots down the hands, and of course those trademark Therizinosaurus claws, which are absolutely massive on this figure. They definitely look really cool. There's actually some pretty nice detail within the claws themselves as well, showing that Mattel usually always goes the extra mile as far as adding in detail and giving us a very, very highly detailed sculpt on our figures. You can see more feather detail here in the stomach region, as well as a little tiny bit of girth, but the dinosaur overall is pretty slender. You can see some more really nice skin texture and stuff as we lead to the underside. You also may be able to take note to the fact that the green stops there in the chest before transitioning to the dark blue, the primary body color, and then the rest of the dinosaur remains just that dark blue. Once the green disappears and then this reddish coloration here on the top disappears, the rest of the figure is nothing but a dark blue. I don't even see speckles or anything that I'm really picking up on the figure, which is pretty surprising. We usually have some sort of speckling, but I don't really see anything on this one. You can see some more beautiful feathers here in the thigh region of our Therizinosaurus. Some slightly scruffy looking feathers there in the thigh. Some more really nice skin texture here in the back of the thigh. I think that might be the nicest out of all of the figure when it comes to the skin texture that I've seen so far. As you move down, you see the feathers disappear. We go back to just the skin of the Therizinosaurus. You can see a very nicely elaborated and muscular calf. And then as we move down, you can see the foot sculpt looks pretty good. We've got scoots down the toes, pretty long foot sculpt. So I guess it is a little oversized. Definitely looks a little bit too long, but it's still actually pretty nice looking. You've got the nails there sculpted out pretty nicely. No nail paint or anything, which is, to be expected, especially on one of these smaller basic figures. As you move up here, you've got some more skin wrinkles there, kind of showing some movement of the dinosaur. And then we lead out the length of the tail, which comes in a slight downward curve and then heads up toward the tip. And you can see the feathers actually look really nice. That's probably the largest area of feathers on the dinosaur, because for the most part, they're pretty, fine looking feathers. But then once we get out here, we have actual tail feathers and everything. They're not quite as easy to pick up on how nice they are because of the dark bluish coloration of the figure, but trust me, they definitely look really nice here in hand. And then once we turn the figure around, you're really not going to see too much difference over here compared to what we just saw on the previous side. Everything sculpt-wise looks pretty much the same. Of course, being an articulated figure, everything and even the positioning of the dinosaur is like pretty straightforward, like it's a pretty stagnant pose for the figure, but you can see the arms and everything are in the same position. Of course, you can articulate them to change that if you'd like, but the legs are really the only difference. You can see this leg is leading, the opposing leg is trailing, but other than that, I don't really see any differences or anything on this side. The paintwork all looks to be pretty precise compared to the previous side, and for the most part, it's actually a really nice paint job for a 5-inch basic figure. Again, not much to it, but at least there's a few different tones of color, and when they say basic, they usually mean really basic, so it is nice to see at least a little bit of extra paint on this one compared to some of the previous basics like the Giganotosaurus yesterday. So definitely a pretty fun figure, and I'm so psyched to have a Therizinosaurus in the 5-inch basic line now. As far as articulation goes, it's your standard when it comes to these figures. We have arm articulation, although I will say the arms are actually a little bit stiff. And then we have leg articulation, also a little stiff, but they do move. And then we have a swiveled tail, which that's the first time I moved it. It was a little stiff as well, but now it's, working itself in. And again, I will say I'm really impressed with its balance. The balance, of course, you would expect pretty good balance with a little bit larger feet, but the balance is actually really nice. It stands really well. For a length on the Therizinosaurus, you are looking at about not even 5 inches, actually. Let's see. We got about 4 3/4 inches, or around 12 centimeters. So the Giganotosaurus was definitely quite a bit longer than the Therizinosaurus yesterday. And then we have the height at about 3 inches, or around 7.5 centimeters, closing in on 8 centimeters. For a size comparison, there is Mr. Papo T-Rex, the Attack Pack Colovosaurus, and Robert Muldoon from the Mattel Jurassic World toy line in comparison to our Therizinosaurus, and you can see that this one is very small, even compared to the Giganotosaurus yesterday. I feel like, again, with the length being a bit different, the overall size is definitely quite a bit different, but the height of this one is obviously larger than the Giganotosaurus, so it does have an upside as far as that goes, but definitely still a pretty small figure. And then for a second size comparison, here is the Giganotosaurus from yesterday that we had taken a look at with the Therizinosaurus, and you can definitely see that the Giga is a little bit bigger, definitely more body mass, obviously longer. The Therizinosaurus wins the height war here, but regardless, again, two really cool figures, and if you happen to have an Aldi's nearby, I really recommend picking both of them up before they're gone. So this Jurassic World Dominion 5-inch basic Therizinosaurus from Mattel is another really cool figure. Again, I'm not too sure how many people out there still collect the 5-inch basic line. I know a lot of people aren't really a big fan of them because the proportions are so off and they just look a little silly at times, but I've always been a fan of this line. I love the basic figures. The larger 12-inch versions are some of my favorite Mattel figures normally anyway that get released, so I'm a big fan of those figures, and that follows through here to the 5-inch basic ones. Not quite as big of a fan of these as I am of the 12-inch versions, but these are still really cool, and I'm hoping that we get both of these species in the 12-inch lineup as well, but even still having the 5-inch version of the Therizinosaurus is really cool, and I'm happy to finally have an opportunity to take a look at a Mattel Therizinosaurus in hand. I'm really looking forward to the larger version that they have coming out that should be hitting Target stores within the next month, but it looks really cool sculpt-wise. Again, the proportions are off, as you usually find when it comes to these figures, but it doesn't look too terrible on this one, I think. The sculpt as well is really highly detailed, also something you find really quite often when it comes to a Mattel figure. They've done a good job of sculpting out the feathers on the figure because we don't really get too many feathered dinosaurs from Mattel, so I was really happy to see that the feather detail on this one does look really quite nice. Really looking forward to checking out a Pyroraptor in the near future because that one's definitely going to have lots of feathers, but again, this one's definitely a very nice looking sculpt, fine detail wise, and the paint job of this one is pretty fun. It's better than most of the basic figures because we at least have 3 different tones of color on this one, where we usually only have like 2 tones of color on most of the basic figures, so that is a plus as well. Of course, they can always be improved upon, especially just by simply adding in nail paint would help immensely on every Mattel release, and specifically on a Therizinosaurus you would expect to have nail paint, but it's not the end of the world and it's not something that I actually expected. Some pretty fun articulation, but because they're basic you don't get all that much articulation or action features or anything like that, so again, another thing you have to come into purchasing the figures knowing is you're not going to get quite as much when it comes to articulation or action features or anything like you would for a mainline release of these figures. So as a whole, I will say I really quite like this Therizinosaurus, and I'm really happy that I was able to finally get a hold of one, because I was really quite confident, honestly, that it was going to be a nightmare to find one when these were officially announced, because I know these figures don't usually come to my area, and then yesterday was pretty stressful finding out that they had them near my area, but unfortunately the Therizinosaurus was sold out, so really happy to have officially found one, and really psyched to add it to my collection. If you are interested, make sure you check your local Aldi store, because they may still have them. I would imagine they probably do, or they're probably getting pretty close to selling out. They are there only for Easter, so make sure you head to your local store immediately if you are interested in picking one of these up so you don't miss out either. And make sure you also like, comment, and subscribe, and I will see you in the next review. Thanks for watching.